Welcome back to the deep dive. When we talk about anatomy,
Hmm.
most people just picture the finished product.
Right. The structures you can see.
Exactly, the bones, the muscles, the fully formed organs.
Right.
But today, we are going uh, deeper, right to the source code. We're basically opening the instruction manual for building a human being.
That's a great way to put it. We're diving into the overarching concepts in embryological development. And this is more than just, a list of steps. This chapter essentially gives you the entire vocabulary and grammar of life.
Mm.
It details the fundamental rules, the genes, the signaling pathways, the mechanisms of restriction that dictate every single subsequent stage of body formation.
From the first cell division all the way to, say, a specialized lung capillary.
Exactly.
So our goal for you is to distill these incredibly complex, really dense concepts.
The molecular architecture of development.
Yeah, that molecular architecture.
Yeah.
And turn it into a clear, well-paced conversation. When we finish, you'll understand the subtle but, powerful molecular decisions that determine cell fate.
Mhm.
We're going from the blueprint to the building site. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the genetic foundation.
Mm-hmm.
How does this whole construction project even begin?
Well, the initial phase is fascinating because the embryo isn't immediately expressing its own information. Early cleavage, the morula, the blastocyst, all that initial structure is relying on maternal genes.
So they're prepackaged.
They are. Those transcripts were already waiting in the secondary oocyte just to make sure those first few critical steps proceed without a hitch.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The switch happens surprisingly fast. Embryonic genome activation, when the embryo finally turns on its own machinery. It occurs around the 4 to 8 cell stage. That's when the new organism starts expressing its own polarity genes and, initiating all that cell interaction.
Exactly. And this early development is really just a series of binary choices. It's an elegant, decisive choreography that sets up the 3 core lineages right away.
Okay, what are they?
So you have the trophoblast, which will interact with the mother, the hypoblast or primitive endoderm, and then the epiblast, which becomes the actual embryo.
Aye.
And what's remarkable is how ancient this system is. The basic controls are highly conserved between vertebrates and even invertebrates.
So that's the schedule. What are the tools? We're talking about master regulatory genes.
We are. The heavy hitters are these major families of transcriptional regulators. The most famous are probably the Homeobox genes.
Right, I've heard of those.
They're considered instrumental in setting up the entire body plan, determining where the head goes, where the tail goes, all the axial elongation. We also rely on families like the T-box and SOX genes, and, crucially, the major growth factor families. Things like BMPs, FGFs, Wnt pathways.
Like big ones.
These are the regulatory proteins making sure everything is built in the right sequence.
I was struck by the source material mentioning the challenge of even studying these genes. When researchers knock one out in a study, the embryo often shows this incredible capacity for recovery.
That's a key insight. It tells us that development isn't fragile or linear, it's highly redundant.
So it has backups.
It has multiple backup pathways to try and achieve the desired outcome. It really speaks to the fundamental resilience of the body plan.
That resilience is key. But once those genes have laid the groundwork, how do the cells know where they are in 3D space and what their neighbors are doing? That brings us to how cells talk.
The very first step in communication is the acquisition of cell polarity. This is foundational. A cell basically decides it has a top, an apical domain, and a bottom, a basolateral domain.
And that organizes everything else inside.
It organizes everything, where organelles sit, where the communication junctions are placed, and how it attaches to its environment.
And the environment is the extracellular matrix, the scaffolding. How does that interaction actually work?
Okay, picture a construction site. Epithelial cells, the ones forming boundaries and tubes, they lead down this thin, organized layer called the basal lamina. It's made of molecules like laminin.
Okay.
This basal lamina then links up with the much thicker, more fibrous extracellular matrix, or ECM, which is synthesized by the mesenchyme cells underneath.
And that's full of collagen.
Full of collagen and proteoglycans, yeah. And they engage in this constant reciprocal signaling. The epithelium is influenced by the ECM, and in turn, it influences the mesenchyme.
This leads to one of my favorite anatomical aha moments. Those specialized sites where architectural efficiency is just maximized. I mean, the places where two layers form a shared basal membrane.
Yes, these are critical interfaces for rapid exchange. You can visualize three major examples. First, think of gas exchange.
In the lungs.
In the developing lung alveoli, the type 1 pneumocytes and the pulmonary endothelium fuse their basal lamina into one shared ultra-thin sheet.
Then we have fluid filtration, the kidney glomerulus. That's where the podocytes and the systemic endothelium combine their layers to form that glomerular basement membrane.
Precisely. And the third is vital for barrier function. In the developing brain, the astrocyte end feet and the pile-derived endothelium contribute to a shared basement membrane that forms a crucial part of the blood-brain barrier.
It's amazing. Massive vital organs relying on two different cell types sharing one microscopic piece of scaffolding.
And that shared scaffolding is absolutely non-negotiable. If it's flawed, development just stalls or goes awry.
Yeah, the text mentions mutations in ECM molecules, and the consequences are serious.
They are. A defect in type I collagen leads to osteogenesis imperfecta fragile bones. A mutation in fibrillin is linked to Marfan syndrome, which affects connective tissue all over the body. The molecular architecture really is destiny.
Okay, moving on from the structural scaffolding, let's talk messengers, growth factors. We often just think of signals diffusing through water, but the source details 6 different routes for delivery.
It's highly localized and specific. You can sort of group them into 3 main categories. First, you have distance signaling.
Like hormones.
Exactly. That includes endocrine action traveling via the bloodstream from a distant site. Then you have neighbor signaling. This is much more common.
Okay.
Things like paracrine, which diffuses to an adjacent cell, or autocrine, which acts back on the cell that secreted it. But even more direct is juxtacrine, which requires actual cell-to-cell contact.
Because the factor stays on the surface of the cell.
It stays bound to the surface, and then we get into the most surprising ones, the factors that operate from within the cell or are embedded in the structure itself.
Right, like intracrine and matracrine.
That's the third category. Intracrine action is where the factor goes straight into the nucleus of the same cell. And matracrine action, this is brilliant. The factor binds to the ECM.
So it becomes part of the building itself.
It essentially becomes a time-released signal embedded in the tissue where it can act on cells later. It's stored information.
That complexity really underscores that development isn't just a chemical process. It's architectural and physical. The idea of biomechanics playing a role is just fascinating.
It completely changes how we think about the environment. The stiffness of the extracellular matrix is itself a signal that determines cell fate.
How so?
Well, if you take a mesenchymal stem cell and put it on a stiff matrix, the physical tension literally pushes it toward an osteoblastic or bone-forming lineage.
And on a soft matrix.
On a soft matrix, the lack of tension encourages it to become an adipocyte. Fat. Physical forces are instructing genetic expression.
That's a huge insight. Now, before we move on, the source gives an important caution about timing, which is necessary for anyone reading research in this field.
Yes, heterochrony. It's the difference in developmental timing between species. You just cannot extrapolate findings from, say, mouse models directly to humans.
The speed is that different.
It's significant. Human somite generation happens roughly every 5 hours. In mice, it's every 2. Progenitor cell expansion for motor neurons takes 2 to 3 weeks in us versus a few days in mice. That timing profoundly impacts the scale and organization of the final product.
Okay, let's shift now to the sequence of commitment, defining cell fate. How does that stem cell, which can do anything, restrict itself down to a single specialized neuron?
It's a beautifully ordered, sequential process. It all starts with competence, the simple ability of a tissue to even receive and respond to an inductive signal.
Okay, so it has to be listening first.
It has to be listening. Once it responds, it loses that broad capacity and becomes restricted. The cell is now on a specific pathway. The next step is determination, meaning the cell is now programmed to follow that path no matter what.
Even if you move it to a different environment.
Exactly. And the final step is differentiation, where it progresses to its final specialized phenotype. And you can see this hierarchy reflected in the proteins the cells are making.
Right. There are primary, secondary, and tertiary proteins.
There are. You have primary proteins, which are just the housekeeping items for metabolism. Then secondary proteins, which are specific to the determined state, like arginase in the liver. And finally, tertiary proteins, synthesized only by the fully differentiated cell-like hemoglobin in a red blood cell.
So within this framework, we get 2 classic types of tissue interaction. Permissive versus instructive. Sound like one is just supportive, and the other is actively changing things.
That's the distinction. A permissive interaction provides the necessary ingredients, a signal for maintenance, maybe mitosis, but the cell was already internally programmed. The signal just supports its inherent destiny.
But the instructive interaction is the really fascinating part. This signal causes the restriction.
It fundamentally changes the cell type, precisely. The famous example is the optic cup inducing the overlying ectoderm to form the lens vesicle. If you take that ectoderm and put it somewhere else, no lens.
And Wessel's principles really lay this out clearly.
Beautifully. Tissue A makes tissue B develop. If A is gone, B doesn't happen. And most surprisingly, A can even change tissue D, which normally would do something else, to develop just like B.
And the experimental evidence for that is wild, like taking chicken flank ectoderm.
Which has no business growing a mammary gland.
Right. And pairing it with mouse mammary mesenchyme, and it develops mammary gland-like structures. The signal from the mouse tissue just overrode the chicken's default fate.
It shows the sheer power of that instructive signal. And these interactions don't vanish when we're adults. They continue, influencing things like metaplastic changes and even cancer susceptibility. Development never truly ends.
To quickly summarize the result of these decisions, segment 5 defines the cellular hierarchy that comes out of all this.
Right. We move from stem cells, which start to typitin and become restricted. Adult stem cells are maintained by dividing asymmetrically.
So one daughter stays a stem cell, the other differentiates.
Exactly, or they divide symmetrically just to expand the pool.
And of course, the great leap forward here has been our ability to reverse engineer this whole process.
Absolutely. Creating induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPSCs, from adult cells is a triumph of understanding this hierarchy. By introducing a few key transcription factors, we can force a differentiated cell back into a pluripotent state.
And below stem cells are progenitor cells.
Like myoblasts, they're already determined, but they still proliferate before their final differentiation.
And at the bottom of the hierarchy, you have terminally differentiated cells, which can't divide anymore. Neurons, for example.
And we have to mention the ultimate form of terminal differentiation, apoptosis, planned cell death.
Which is vital for sculpting the final form, like separating our fingers and toes.
Without apoptosis, we'd have paddles instead of hands.
Now we get to the movement and shaping, morphogenesis and pattern formation. This is where all those cells assemble into complex structured organs.
Morphogenesis is simply the assumption of and change in form. Gastrulation is a classic example, but let's look closely at branching morphogenesis, which creates organs like the lungs, kidneys, and salivary glands.
Let's use the duct example because it perfectly illustrates the molecular tug-of-war that creates that branching shape.
It's an elegant reciprocal interaction, the epithelial duct and the surrounding mesenchyme. The mesenchyme secretes an enzyme called hyaluronidase, which breaks down the epithelial basal lamina.
And wherever the lamina breaks down, the cells divide.
They're stimulated to divide rapidly, so that's the grow signal.
So where does the split, the cleft, come from?
Well, the mesenchyme simultaneously secretes collagen III fibrils, specifically where the clefts will form. These fibrils protect the basal lamina from the hyaluronidase.
Oh, so it slows down mitosis in those exact spots.
It slows it right down. The collagen is a physical shield, ensuring the cells divide rapidly everywhere except the center, which causes the structure to push out and split into two new branches. It's patterning through differential growth rates.
Governed by the ECM.
Exactly. This highlights that development isn't just about inductive mechanisms like sequential gene expression, but also morphogenetic mechanisms, which rely on physical, epigenetic, and mechanical interactions.
And you can generate more complex patterns with fewer genes that way.
Far fewer. And this brings up highly advanced concepts like buckling morphogenesis, where sheer mechanical tension in growing epithelial sheets, especially in the gut, informs looping and growth rate.
And of course, the mathematical models, like Alan Turing's 1952 prediction of patterning using an activator and an inhibitor.
It just shows that physics and math are intrinsically involved in the shape of life.
That complexity leads us right into the cutting-edge research, ethics, and computer modeling. Modern techniques are generating just massive amounts of data.
But the breakthrough technique has really been 3D culture, which allows cells to form organoids. These hollow spheres self-organize and actually recapitulate embryonic pathways.
Sometimes forming structures resembling a miniature cerebral cortex or a kidney glomerulus.
It's incredible.
It is incredible, but the source material is quick to caution against over-extrapolation.
And it's crucial. We have to remember that results from organoids or iPSCs or chimeras cannot be directly equated to development in a living human embryo. There's retained epigenetic memory, species-specific timelines. It's not the same.
And this rapid ability to create lifelike structures in a lab has naturally raised some significant ethical challenges,
It has, particularly regarding the historical 14-day rule.
which restricted growing human embryos in vitro past the formation of the primitive streak.
Right. And now the creation of these sophisticated self-organizing structures, sometimes called sheaths or synthetic human entities with embryo-like features that could potentially survive far longer, forces us to re-examine those ethical boundaries globally.
Finally, to handle all this complexity, we need serious computation. In Segment 8, we see the reliance on embryological ontology.
Yes, an ontology is basically a structured hierarchy. It's like a highly specific dictionary and a family tree combined. They are essential bioinformatic databases used to trace cell lineage, match gene activation temporally, and link all these early processes to the final adult anatomy.
But using big data brings big warnings. If the foundational concepts used to build these computer algorithms were flawed, the sheer volume of data they output might not actually answer the right questions.
And this is where the language itself becomes a risk. The early language and structure used in these ontologies, though necessary at the time, may now prevent researchers from revising or redefining concepts simply because the computer models are built around the old definitions.
Okay, let's synthesize the three core takeaways here.
Mm-hmm.
First, development is fundamentally governed by these highly conserved gene families, proceeding through early binary choices with incredible resilience.
Right.
Second, the entire process hinges on constant, nuanced signaling, not just diffusion, but contact and physical forces determined by the extracellular matrix. And third, cell fate follows a strict, irreversible sequence of restriction, which leads to complex physical shaping via processes like that push-pull mechanism of branching morphogenesis.
Understanding these concepts is truly the key to unlocking everything that follows in anatomy and medicine. They provide the necessary vocabulary to address everything from congenital disorders to advances in regenerative medicine. And this raises an important question for you to consider. As computational models become more powerful and they begin to define their own concepts based on past data, how can we ensure that the human element, the next generation of developmental biologists, retains the freedom to question and redefine the very language we use to describe life's construction?
So what does this all mean? It means the greatest complexity, the most profound architectural decisions are all found right at the start. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.